getting kind of boring working on code 10 minutes every day. Guess it's time to learn something new. Yo guys, DevHedron back with another video, and in this video I will be going over how I learned React.js in 48 hours. I will be going over what I learned and what I understand about this web framework or library or whatever it is. This video is structured as intro, projects made, every single thing I learned explained, and finally the conclusion. Uh, and also note that I don't really know JS or JavaScript, and I've only worked with it for a small amount of time. First off, if you don't know what React.js is, it is a library for building user interfaces in JavaScript or TypeScript. In the 48 hours of me learning React.js, here are all the projects I made by following tutorials or on my own. The very first project I made was a web app made by following DevEd's tutorial, a React tutorial for beginners. The main things I learned from this are React components, React hooks, hooks variables, inline and normal functions, events, props, exports, modular JavaScript, logic and rendering separation, imports, node modules is too big, JSX. The second project I made was a task app by following someone's tutorial, but I couldn't find whose tutorial I watched, to be honest, as there are tons of task app tutorials which use React and they're on YouTube. The main things I learned from this are JSON, local storage, filtering lists, UUID v4, looping through lists. The third project I made was a recipe app by following DevEd's tutorial on it. The main things I learned from this are APIs, React hooks, async and await, fetch, prevent default, search bar implementation, types of inputs, types of buttons, use effect, passing arguments, CSS modules. The fourth and final project I made was a movie app, and I made this on my own, and it works sometimes. The main things I learned from this are tutorials are the best, working on my own is kind of hard. APIs are, well, crap. How the hell do you access the returns of an API call? One file is enough for React DOM, root ID. I tried my best making these projects and I did make another program, but I won't even count that as a project as it was just me being bored and messing around with React. And all the links to the tutorials I followed will be in the description. Now I will go over and explain what I learned, and if I say anything that is wrong or I misinterpret it, please comment down below correcting my mistake. The very first thing I learned was React components, and these are basically React objects. Most JavaScript files, if you're writing modular JavaScript code, require default exports, but since I made some of my projects single file, I did not have to worry about this, and that's it. Components can be something as simple as a function as well, so you don't have to worry about writing a class. The second thing I learned was React hooks from the official React website. They let you use state and other React features without writing a class. So in most React projects or React web apps I wrote, I was using React hooks to set the state of a variable or set the data of a variable. And I can give another example using React hooks is, let's say if I were coding a game in React, I would have different player states, right, for the player. So I could set the player state depending on if I get input or not. If I'm not getting input, the default player state would be idle. Otherwise, it would be moving, running, or shooting, whatever. The third thing that I learned was inline and normal functions. If you remember what I said in the start of the video, you know that I don't really know JS that well. And I will just say that these React tutorials taught me a lot. One of the things they taught me is having inline and normal functions. Normal functions start with the keyword function and then you have the name of the function and then the arguments, but you can also have inline functions, and these are basically constant, and they're variables, constant variables, and you assign them to a function like this, and then you just have the argument it's taking in, and then you have the code that processes the argument. The fourth thing that I learned was props. These are how you send arguments to a React component, and they play very crucial roles in writing React web applications. The fifth thing that I learned was exports, and this is how I previously mentioned that you have to export every single React component that you write unless you're working single file, and this taught me modular JavaScript as well. One of the most interesting things I learned was logic and rendering separations. I usually and mainly make games, so this was very similar to the separation or different parts of a game loop, except a bit different. As in React, you have first the declaration of the variables, then you have the functions that you're going to use, and then in the end, you have the rendering, which is done in a return statement. And in that return statement, you write JSX code, which is a mixture of JS and HTML. And this is another thing that I learned. Another thing that I learned was imports. You can import other JavaScript files just like you do in Python or C or C++. And this is something that makes me like JavaScript even more. And I'm just going to mention that JavaScript is a lot faster than Python as well. So if you're looking for a Python alternative that is faster, definitely look into JavaScript. Another thing that I learned was node modules. This is the folder that contains all the modules you need for your npm or node.js project, and it is too big, like too big. This is the equivalent of setting up a virtual environment in Python, but way bigger. JavaScript also has some awesome support for JSON, I've got to say. I mean, it's not like JSON, it literally stands for JavaScript Object Notation. Local storage, this is how you can cache the data or store it in cookies, and then when the user goes to the website again, you can re-access it and use it to return to the state the website was in before the user left it. Another thing that I learned was fetch, async, and await, and these are the functions I use to get data from the API, and then I converted it to JSON so that I could actually use the data. And these are default functions in JavaScript, if I'm right, so you don't really have to import a module or anything like that, and you can do this in plain old vanilla JavaScript as well. CSS modules, you can also make CSS modules which you can include in your JavaScript files and then use them to style the React component. Now, something that frustrates me a lot, how do you access the returns of an API call? Like, please help, man. Seriously. Another thing that I learned was one file is enough for React. You don't need to have tons of files for a small React project, and you don't need a ton of organization to make a decent application. The last and final thing I learned was React DOM, and this is what React uses to render. Once you've written your app, there's an index.js file in your project which uses the React DOM to render your app or your React component, and it does that by getting the root ID, and then it renders it onto the root ID of the document. That's how I learned React in 48 hours, and I guess it's time to make a website. Link to resources in the description. And I'll see you guys next time.